Good afternoon, everybody. This is Herman de Leeuw, the Executive Director of the Groningen Declaration Network. I'm very happy to see all of you and to engage in a discussion on the Apostille Convention. Let me show you a few slides. We are talking today on the HCCH Apostille Convention, which deals with global document and data mobility. It's my utmost pleasure to have with us two experts coming from the Hague Conference on Private International Law, HCCH, which I will introduce to you in a few seconds. And also we have with us Matt Patinski, whom I will also introduce, who will serve as the moderator. It will be my pleasure to now start introducing you after a brief video with words of welcome by the GDN President Kathleen Massey, which will come up in a few minutes.
Kathleen Massey, and I'm the new president of the Groningen Declaration Network, and I'd like to welcome you to the GDN's new webinar series. I'm so pleased that you have decided to participate in the GDN by attending today's webinar. Your involvement is critical to the success of the network. The GDN is a global organization that brings together people and organizations who are committed to making it possible and easy for people worldwide to consult and share their authentic educational data with whomever they want, whenever they want, wherever they are. Today you are joining thought leaders from across the world to pave the way for this to be done well, equitably, and by developing trusted networks and using contemporary secure technology. I invite you to continue your involvement in the GDN by attending additional webinars and by joining us at our next annual meeting in Ottawa, Canada in May 2021. I hope you find this live webinar both informative and engaging, and I thank you again for joining us today.
Yeah, well, a big word of thanks to our sponsors. And the Apostille Convention basically deals with securing trust in documents or data in the context of global mobility. Just so as to allow Christophe Bernesconi to start off once he has been introduced, I will not start with him, but first with Matthew Patinski, who is the CEO of Parchment and co-founder and former CEO of Blackboard Incorporated. Parchment supports the largest network for academic credential exchange in the United States, spanning 6,500 secondary and post-secondary education organizations that exchange more than 20 million transcripts and other records in 2019. And the numbers may go up for 2020, isn't it, Matt? Matthew is an assistant research professor in the sociology program at Arizona State University, serves on the board of trustees of the Woodrow Wilson Graduate School of Teaching and Learning. And in 2012, the Teachers College at Columbia University awarded Matt with the President's Medal of Excellence to recognize his impact and innovation in the field of education, technology, and entrepreneurship. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Political Science from American University, an educational Master in Education Policy from Harvard University Graduate School of Education, and a PhD in Sociology of Education from Teachers College, Columbia University. Now, next speaker, Brody. Mr. Brody Warren is attaché to the Secretary General and Senior Legal Officer at the Permanent Bureau of the Hague Conference on Private International Law, henceforward HCCH. He joined the Permanent Bureau in 2014, working as part of the International Legal Cooperation and Civil Procedure team. Following his appointment to the position of attaché in 2020, Mr. Warren has continued to work in the day-to-day operation of the 1961 Apostille Convention under the supervision of the Secretary General. Prior to joining the Permanent Bureau, Mr. Warren worked as sub-editor for legal publisher LexisNexis in the press gallery of the Australian Federal Parliament between 2012 and 2014. During his time, he also completed a 5-month placement with the Embassy of the Argentine Republic. In 2014, he was awarded the Peter Nijg Hague Conference Internship. Well, just as others struggle with the pronunciation of my name, I might struggle with the pronunciation of this name. Nevertheless, Brody Warren holds a Bachelor of Laws, Honours and Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Spanish from the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia, and is admitted to practice in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Australia. He speaks English and French, is proficient in Dutch and Spanish, and has recently commenced study of Arabic. Ahlan wa sahlan. Now comes Christophe Bernesconi. Dr. Christophe Bernesconi is the 4th Secretary General of the Hague Conference on Private International Law, HCCH. He took office on the 1st July 2013. In 2018, he was reappointed for a further term of 5 years. Dr. Bernesconi had joined the Permanent Bureau, that is the Secretariat of the HCCH, in September 1997 as Secretary, became First Secretary in May 2000 and Deputy Secretary General in July 2011. He holds a law degree from Fribourg University in Switzerland, an legal master degree, LLM, in comparative law from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and a doctoral degree in private international law from Fribourg University, summa cum laude. As Secretary General, Dr. Bernesconi is responsible for the administration of the HCCH and the operation of the Permanent Bureau. He has long-standing expertise in the fields of international civil procedural law, service of process, taking of evidence, access to justice, jurisdiction of courts, recognition and enforcement of judgments, international commercial and finance law, international family and child protection law, as well as international legal cooperation. He designed and is the principal administrator of the electronic Apostille program, EAP, that Brody Warren will tell us more about. As Secretary General, his current focus is on implementing various strategic directions of the HCCH, including progress towards universality and further developing inclusiveness. And with this, I think I should leave the floor for Christophe to start presenting.
Thank you very much, Herman, for these kind words. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Greetings from The Hague. It's both a pleasure and an honor to join you this afternoon, end of the afternoon here in The Hague, for this session on the Apostille Convention, and then in particular on the so-called EAPP, the Electronic Apostille Program, and what it all means for the authentication of diplomas. Thank you for your interest. I take it that some of you might actually not be that familiar with the organization that Brody and I here represent, the Hague Conference on Private National Law. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we call it the HCCH. So I will start my short remarks by briefly introducing to you the organization before saying a few basic words about the Apostille Convention, what it does and why it does what it does so well, and why it's such an important instrument. I will start my comments by saying that we live in a world of private international law. Now, what does that mean? It means that we as people, as citizens, as family members, as commercial operators, as investors, we are regularly involved in cross-border situations, transactions, or movements. We engage in cross-border marriages. We may be facing cross-border divorces. We do cross-border business. We study abroad. We may be involved in cross-border legal proceedings. Suddenly, I may be sued in Australia, who knows? These situations raise questions of what we call private international law. And the typical questions that come up in those circumstances are, which court has jurisdiction to hear a case in these circumstances? Is it the Australian court? Is it the courts here in the Netherlands? Is it maybe a court in the US that may hear litigation? What law applies to these situations? What can you do with a foreign judgment once you have obtained such a judgment? Can you easily recognize and enforce it in another state? And most importantly also, what about cooperation mechanisms that help people and judicial authorities involved in these situations to overcome the challenges that are often raised by these cross-border situations? Now, the idea of private international law is, think of them as road signs, as traffic signals that show you the way to go. Is it the court in Australia? Is it the court in the Netherlands? Is it the law of the US? Is it the law of Switzerland? Can I enforce my judgment in China? What about cooperation mechanisms with South Africa to overcome the challenges of an international legal procedure? This is what we do here at this organization. We harmonize this package of rules that apply in these cross-border situations so that the traffic signs and the road signals are the same around the world, that wherever you are, you get the same answer as to who has jurisdiction, whose law applies, and what cooperation mechanisms may be in place to overcome these challenges. So since we are in a world that is increasingly interconnected, private international law plays indeed a very, very important part in the overall development of an international, robust international legal framework. The topic might be particularly important nowadays, but the history of the organization goes back a long, long way. It actually goes back to 1893, when the first so-called Hague Conference, the first meeting of the Hague Conference, was held here in The Hague. After the Second World War, it became a permanent organization with a secretariat, which is called the Permanent Bureau, where we are now with Brody. And it really became, over the years, a truly international, global organization. The organization currently has 85 members, that's 84 member states, plus the European Union, which in its own right is a member of the HCCH. And in addition to these members, we have currently 70 non-member contracting parties to our international treaties, or HCCH conventions, as we call them. That's important because the way we harmonize these rules of private international law is by adopting Hague conventions to which individual states can then become a party. And we do this work, this harmonization of private international law, for international family and child protection law. You may have heard of the Child Abduction Convention. This is about parental kidnapping of children. You may have heard about the Inter-Country Adoption Convention. There is a Service of Process Convention, a Taking of Evidence Convention, a Choice of Court. So we deal with familial and child protection matters, with international legal cooperation, and also international commercial and financing. And of course, we also deal with the authentication of public documents. And that brings me to the Apostille Convention. What is the issue that we face in this context? In most legal orders, when you want to use a public document that has been established, that has been done in a foreign jurisdiction, you can't just use it like that. You can't just come here to the Netherlands with a birth certificate from Georgia, or you can't just use a notarial act from Australia here in the Netherlands, or in Quebec, or in other parts of the world. The origin of that public document needs to be authenticated before it can be used. In other words, the end user of a foreign public document, and again, I'm talking about a birth certificate, a marriage certificate, a death certificate, a notarial act, or a public school diploma, a university diploma. When a person wants to use that document in another jurisdiction, the authenticity, the origin of that document needs to be assessed and confirmed. Traditionally, this was done, and in some instances is still done, through a very long, comprehensive, and inefficient chain of legalization, where you take your document, say your birth certificate or your diploma, and you go, say, to the registrar of the university, then you have to go to, say, the Secretary of State, or first to a notary in the US, then to the Secretary of State, then to the Ministry of, or the Department of Foreign Affairs, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, however it's called. Then you have to go to the embassy or the consulate of the state in which you want to use that document. And eventually you may even have to go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the state where you want to use that document. Each time the user has to typically pay a sum of money to get the certification that the previous signature on that document is indeed the signature from the person it says this signature is coming from. And so you get at the end a document that is full of signatures and stamps and ribbons, each confirming the authenticity of the previous signature. That's why it's called the chain of legalization. Now, you will agree with me that this is a very cumbersome, a very inefficient, a very costly, and just a process that's not of this day and age anymore. That's why in the 1950s already, the HCCH decided to look into the matter and to simplify this process as much as possible. And so they decided that ideally what we would do is to just push aside this whole chain of legalization and replace it with one single formality, the issuance of an apostille certificate. The idea being that the person would take the public document, go to an authority designated by the state of origin of that document, get what is called an apostille certificate, and with that single formality, be in a position to use the document abroad without any further formality. That was quite a groundbreaking new process, but it has become the norm. It has become actually a very important, practically important, and very successful convention. As we speak, the Apostille Convention has 118 contracting parties from around the world. There are millions and millions and millions of apostilles being issued every single year around the world, each time having a direct impact on people's life. People don't have to go from A to B to C to D to E, each time having to pay and ask for a certificate. They go to ideally one single office, get an apostille, and can use the document, say the diploma, abroad. Based on our statistics that we have, we assess that approximately every 2.5 seconds, an apostille is being issued somewhere in the world. And that shows you how important, practically speaking, the Apostille Convention is. I say currently 118 contracting parties, but there are still a number of important jurisdictions in the pipeline that we expect to join this convention relatively soon, hopefully in the future. That is, for example, China, for the mainland of China, where the convention does currently not yet apply. Canada is actively preparing the accession to the Apostille Convention. A couple of days ago, we have heard that Indonesia is making good progress to join the convention, and there are others that explore the possibility as well. Brody will show you in a moment what this apostille certificate looks like. You may ask yourself, what is this name? It's a funny name, apostille. What does it actually mean? It's of Latin origin, of course, but it's typically a French word that's being used in a different context in French as well. And it basically refers to an attachment to something to explain the origin of that something. That's literally what an apostille means. And so it's literally also what an apostille in our context does. It authenticates and certifies the origin of an underlying public document. And it's very important to keep in mind that the apostille only authenticates the origin of the underlying public document. It does not go as far as to say that the content of that underlying public document is true, correct, and authentic as well. That's not the purpose of the legalization chain, and it's not the purpose of an apostille. Now, you have heard that the origin of the Apostille Convention goes actually back to 1961, and you may rightly so say, yeah, but the world has changed in the meantime. There is new technology available that could authenticate the origin of a public document just based on modern technology, and we don't need this old stuff anymore of an apostille certificate. You will not believe how many times I have heard in these more than 20 years that I'm with this organization that the new technology will make the Apostille Convention obsolete. And I'm still waiting for that. Well, I'm not really waiting, but it really doesn't, it hasn't happened yet. Modern technology has not displaced the apostille certificate. Why? I think the basic answer to this question is that people still take a lot of trust in knowing that there is a state designated authority that has been involved in the process of authenticating an underlying public document, such as, for example, a school diploma. We do, of course, invite these, we call them competent authorities, the authorities that issue apostilles, to use modern technology. But just the fact that there is something that's being called an apostille that has been issued by a state-designated competent authority gives people still the highest degree of trust and confidence in the origin of that document. And that's why when my predecessor as Secretary General at some stage put me in charge of the Apostille Convention, looking after the Apostille Convention and its practical operation, I have to admit that as a lawyer, I was not terribly thrilled about the prospect of looking after something that sounds very administrative and maybe even a bit boring for a lawyer, because the Apostille Convention does not really raise a lot of super exciting legal questions. But I quickly realized how important the Apostille Convention is for people's life and what difference it can make in someone's life, when that person has to produce a public document abroad. And so based on this realization, I thought of encouraging the competent authorities of doing two things, basically. One is start issuing electronic apostilles with a digital certificate, so that what's being transmitted into the other state is actually an electronic file that is secured through a digital certificate with a proper infrastructure and signature that is transmitted instantaneously to the other state, and that can be used in this other state. So the use of electronic apostilles instead of paper apostilles was the first incentive. The second incentive was to encourage these authorities to start operating electronic registers of apostilles, so that when you receive an apostille in the receiving state, you can just quickly go online, access the electronic register of the issuing authority, and verify the origin of that apostille to make sure that it really comes where it says it's coming from. Now you may ask, and this will be my final comment, does this new technology, and some say that DLT and blockchain will eventually replace the apostille convention, or do these digital certificates not replace the need for the apostille convention? And again, my answer to this is no, because of the trust factor, but also because in the apostille convention itself, there is actually a reference to say that if the legal framework between two states, or even if the practice between two states is such that you don't need an apostille certificate, and you can authenticate the origin of a document through other means, even more easily achieved than through the simple issuance of an apostille, then that other system is good enough for the apostille convention. So the apostille convention does not impose itself over further developments that may occur and facilitate even the production of public documents in another jurisdiction. What we have seen in reality, though, again, is that the competent authorities start using electronic means and other modern technology to issue electronic apostilles, and that therefore the the apostille convention remains relevant in the context of technology that's developing and more and more accessible also to users and competent authorities. And so based on that, I remain very confident that the apostille convention is here to stay for decades to come. We are quite pleased to see how more and more competent authorities are picking up the EAPP, and Brody will tell you more about this. But for the time being, that's what I wanted to share with you to set the background, as it were, to our discussion. Thank you for your interest, and we'll be more than happy to take questions that you may have. Back to you, Herman. Thank you.
Thank you for the expose, Christophe, and I realize there's a lot to say. It's always a challenge to keep time. So I hope you will excuse me to introduce Brody without much further ado. Brody, please pick up from here.
Thank you, Herman, and hello, everyone. I suppose to pick up where the Secretary General left off, I suppose I'm just going to go through a little bit of the more practical details, I suppose, about the electronic apostille program. I think one key element that is sort of a guiding principle for the electronic apostille program is looking at the idea of what we call functional equivalence, the idea that having an apostille that is issued validly in one country essentially is to be accepted in all other parties to the convention, whether that be in paper form, electronic form, as long as it was valid at the time of issuance by that authority that legally has the authority under the convention to issue it. And that has been quite helpful as a guiding principle in terms of maintaining the flexibility that's necessary to implement it at the electronic level. But it also means that it's kind of perfectly compatible with the text of the convention, which, as Christophe mentioned, is from 1961. But it does help us to kind of move forward in a bit more of a modern solution. The restrictions, of course, the same limitations or the same requirements apply to electronic apostilles in terms of, and I'll show you in a minute, but it sort of has a standard certificate with 10 standard items that need to be filled in. And the apostille itself, as was mentioned earlier, only verifies or only authenticates the origin of the document to which it refers. So sort of the certificate itself is saying that the document that's underlying came from, well, was signed by the person who says it was signed by, that person signing the document had the right legal capacity to sign it at that point in time, and that the seal or signature was valid at that point in time. And all of these principles can kind of be transposed as equally to the electronic environment as well. In the context of the EAPP, just as with paper apostilles, we have sort of the two elements required by the convention as well. So first is the actual electronic apostille certificate with the underlying public document, which is usually sort of a secured PDF file with a digital signature. That's the most common version, and I'll show you a couple in just a moment. And the second element is what we call the electronic register or e-register. That is a requirement under the convention. So traditionally it was a paper kind of book in which all apostilles issued were recorded with a number and that sort of thing. Obviously that can be done much more efficiently and in fact much more securely nowadays electronically. And many states now have websites in where the recipient of an apostille can go to that website to check that it was indeed, you know, valid, and that sort of thing, that the one that they've got in front of them matches exactly the version that was issued and no one's tampered with it in between. And again, you could probably imagine that these kind of things can be done more securely and more efficiently electronically than they ever could have been done in paper form. An interesting point to make for us is that while the flexibility has been great at allowing a modern solution, the flexibility is also meant that different states and different contracting parties to the convention are free to develop their own systems, which does mean that there are different countries at different levels. At this point in time, of the 118 contracting parties, we've only got about 40 or just over a third of the contracting parties that have implemented the electronic apostille. So the rest are all still working with paper. That being said, in the last few years, we're certainly seeing an increase in the interest. There's been continuing interest since the launch, but it has meant that I think, particularly in light of the current pandemic as well, the interest in electronic means and facilitating these kind of things will continue to increase. So hopefully that will improve over time. The implementation can be achieved relatively quickly and inexpensively as well. Some states will just they have a single, say, ministry that issues their apostilles, and they will, implement and some off-the-shelf technology for their electronic signature. They use Adobe PDF or equivalent, insert it as a file, and then it's secured and it's able to be emailed to the recipient. Other states have gone for a more comprehensive development where they've overhauled their electronic systems. They've created their own digital signature for the government specifically, and they've developed their own credentials behind that, and then it's decentralized, or maybe there's a completely online application process and things like that too. Other states have even built it into, for example, a consular management system or things like that. I was just going to say, sorry, I was thinking just some examples. I just saw one mentioned in the chat there, but I will jump now, I think, to show you a few examples so you can actually picture what we're talking about here. And I'll just share my screen quickly. First to show you, actually I'll do it this way. So hopefully that's working there. But firstly, I've got on the right here, we've got an example of an electronic apostille, which is a PDF file issued by New Zealand. You can see what I was talking about before in the certification is the 10 standard items. States are free to kind of add their own stylistic touches, of course, but in general, you'll always see the word apostille at the top, the convention, short name of the convention there in French. There's usually some kind of frame or box, as well as the numbered items 1 to 10, and that sort of thing. That's both for paper and electronic apostilles. In this particular one, the signature panel here, you can see down below. If I click that, this is the electronic signature, of course, can verify it, and it says that it's valid and signed by the Authentication Unit, the Department of Internal Affairs in New Zealand, and that's fine. You're sort of reassured. It also has its same thing in the signature panel at the top. So that's the kind of e-apostille component. If I jump then to go and verify this apostille at this is the New Zealand e-register. I've put in here the apostille number and the date which it was issued back in 2016, and we just kind of click verify. We can get back a result that it essentially says yes, that's that, and that it has the seal of it. So it's related to a birth, death, and marriage certificate. You don't get much more information. Another example which I wanted to show you was sort of something from Austria, for example. You can again recognize the same kind of box frame with some the 10 standard items. However, Austria opted for a model where they developed their own digital certificate. If I scroll down, they've got a sample document here in the middle, but their electronic signature of the authority appears at the bottom. This is what the one looked like that was developed by the Austrian ministry. If I click that, it says that it's unknown and there have been some problems. That's usually because the government developed its own. So it's not one that's built into, it's not a commercial solution, so it's not recognized. And so the user that raises a question, but nonetheless, the Austrians have their own e-register as well. If I go here now to show you what it looks like, their system is here, and you can actually upload the file that you've received, an electronic apostille. So I will do that now. I can upload the Austrian sample apostille and click verify, and it will come back, and I can actually re-download it again if I want to. And it says the signature is, yeah, verification was successful. And what's this? Certificate chain is trusted root certificate. Okay, it was valid at the time. So basically that gives you that reassurance. Even if there was a doubt when you were looking solely at the PDF, this is the additional verification or information that you may need in terms of the issuance and the certificate and that sort of thing. Again, that's okay, but of course we do see differences in different systems, and these are kind of some of the more advanced ones where there is more security there as well. And I just wanted to show you one more, was from an example from Colombia, where they have their e-apostille. You can see they've got also a QR code where if you wanted to scan that, you could also verify that online. It doesn't have exactly the frame, but you can see that it has the 10 the same kind of standard things. It has apostille, it's in French at the top here. If I then type this number in, which I've done already, and select the date of issuance, and confirm that you're not a robot, you can then go through and it will actually have the same kind of thing, but actually show me visually, if I've received this in paper or electronic form, you've received it, and you can confirm that the details are the same, not only that the apostille is there, but also the underlying public document, that it is also the same as was originally issued. And these can also be downloaded if you want to print them off or do something as well afterwards. So at that point, I'm just gonna stop sharing for now. We can maybe come back if there are specific questions on those. But that, now you have a little bit of a feel of what it actually looks like when these kind of things are issued. I suppose just quickly, I probably have just a couple of final points, I suppose, before moving to a broader discussion with you all. I think what we have seen is a little bit like, as Christoph mentioned, we are still seeing some hesitation in terms of users and recipients getting used to using digital credentials. But not just sort of socially, but also legislatively. So the legal side, sometimes we're still seeing that countries require a paper original in order to do anything with, for the document to have legal effect. So that's something that I suppose on the law side, we can continue to work with, and it will take time, but also that people get accustomed to seeing a sort of stamp or a seal and that sort of thing, that they want to have that reassurance. So I think, in particular in the Groningen Declaration Network context, seeing that many institutions are already willing to exchange these documents and data without the need for apostille, because the digital authentication can go further and authenticate not only the origin, but also the content. As Christoph mentioned, that's still perfectly compatible with the provisions of the convention. But what we do see in practice is that because of the disparity in technology between different countries, a lot of recipients are still seeking that additional trust of kind of having an apostille, even if it's just a visual thing where actually the authentication is happening digitally behind it. I think DLT was mentioned as well. I think it's something that we're seeing at this point in time, that some countries are interested in different ways, that perhaps you could imagine a situation where you have the apostille and underlying document that are together and sort of in one block, as it were, that's then used as a hash code that is then recorded on kind of a blockchain situation. That's sort of the model that they're looking at the moment. But again, that we're at the very early stages of that. So I think for now, by and large, the most common solution is to use a PDF with an electronic signature, a digital signature there that's behind it. And I think in terms of both how that technology works and the promotion of that in other countries, but also possibly using DLT and that sort of thing, we on our side of HCCH are working with as many countries as possible to make sure that we can continue to promote the use of technology and encourage them to implement the electronic apostille program in a way that best suits kind of needs of their governments in terms of security, but also their citizens in terms of accessibility and the recipients in terms of trusting the authentication of the origin. So I think I'll probably leave it there for now, and perhaps we can come back if there are specific questions on any of the apostille or even elements as well. But I'll pass that back to you, then, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Brody. This was a very thorough expose again. Yeah, and with a view to the time, I might come up with a few questions, but really I think that Matt is burning to touch upon the apostille as well. So let's see what Matt might have as questions for the two of you.
Thank you, Ron. And Christophe, I think you used the adjectives long, comprehensive, and inefficient to describe the world before the apostille. And so I'll use positive adjectives to describe your presentation. I thought it was incredibly comprehensive, clear, and still quite sophisticated in terms of getting into a number of the nuances. So thank you to both. As Ramon mentioned at the beginning, we are recording this. It is a webinar that many folks will have the opportunity to view afterwards. So even if you feel like you are an expert on this topic, I hope you will please use the question and answer feature in Zoom so that we get lots of questions that can help enrich the discussion for the benefit of those who will view later. So if you're not familiar with it, it's just right next to the share screen, you'll see a Q&A button. You can click on that, you can post open questions, and I will use those to ask out to the panelists. But just to get started, I'd like to focus on two particular topics, both of which you've raised. One is the meaning of moving the apostille process to digital, and the other is the process by which that's going to happen over time. So first, the meaning, because I think, Christophe, you made an important distinction that at least I hadn't thought about prior to the panel. And that is the distinction of issuing the apostille digitally, where we still have essentially the basic process and infrastructure. It's just now, instead of happening, relatively inefficiently as paper, it's happening digitally, versus evolving beyond the need of the apostille, because in a sense, the document is self-certifying of the authenticity of its origin. And I wanted to first make sure that is that a distinction you would make, that what you see happening today, neither of you, please, are welcome to answer it. What you see happening today is more about how we maintain the basic apostille certificate, but instead of issuing it in paper format, we can now do it more efficiently digitally. And you see a much longer journey before we get to the point, if we ever do, where we don't need the concept of an apostille, because the document and the technology of issuing the document self-certifies the origin. Is that a meaningful distinction in your mind?
Thank you, Matt, if I may, and I invite Brody to add anything he may have on his mind. But I personally fully agree. with that distinction. And again, I have heard it again and again that the moment has come where this apostille thing has become obsolete, and yet that moment has never arrived. And I don't see it coming our way anytime soon, frankly speaking. Two elements, I guess, support this assessment. One is in particular that the new states joining the Apostille Convention, and there are still a number of states that, you know, keep joining the Apostille Convention. It's an old convention, almost 60 years old, and yet you have new states still joining, important states still joining. Most of these new states now join as an EAPP state. They have this mindset to make the operation of the Apostille Convention as effective and as secure right from the beginning. It is actually a bit more challenging for the long-standing contracting parties to catch up, if I may say so, and to implement the new technology that's readily available and maybe even, you know, quite easily available and not that complex to implement. But still, they have to go through governmental processes and what have you, and make a business case that this is an important thing to do. And I guess I can be so open as to say that this is what we observe in the US, amongst other contracting parties, that you know, the structure in the US is basically such that it's each state within the US that issues its own apostilles, in addition to some federal authorities that can also do it. But only a couple of states in the US have really actively looked into the possibility of issuing electronic apostilles. And as Brody alluded to, the current circumstances of the pandemic have really pushed a number of states in the US to look into this option. And Montana, I think, is the most recent one that has a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, issued its first e-apostille in response to very strong lobbying of a group of interested, you know, industries that really want this e-apostille component to be implemented. So the lobby is for making the apostille efficient and secure. The lobby is not for pushing the apostille aside and replacing it with exclusively modern technology. As I was saying, the fact that you have a government designated authority involved still gives this level of trust and comfort that people, even in the current circumstances, still need and seek for and look for.
So that's a perfect segue to a question Tom Green of ACRO asked through the Zoom Q&A tool, which is, if our focus then is maintaining the apostille, but moving it to a digital issuing and receiving and verification process, I'm going to add to Tom's question. I guess the first piece would be, does the convention today speak to standards of practice for an issuer that, in order to be considered valid, for lack of a better term, an issuer of an apostille must follow these practices to stand behind who originated a document, that then might guide the evaluation of technologies as suitable technologies for issuing a digital version of the apostille? Or said differently, or more directly, what's the basis of standards to understand whether a digital approach to issuing an apostille is consistent with the convention and the prior practice in paper? And how does a receiver of an apostille, and you mentioned the fact that different countries are in different stages of acceptance of electronic versus paper, either socially or technologically, their ability to accept it. How do we disseminate awareness of what an issuer is doing on behalf of the receiver so they can make sense of it, what to expect, and whether or not to consider it valid?
Thanks, Matt. I think I might just jump in there. I think the first question, I suppose, in terms of what are the requirements, essentially, the convention leaves that quite open in some ways. And that's why I guess it applies to both paper apostilles and to electronic ones as well, in terms of that assessment, that in order for the competent authority to issue an apostille for a document that they've received, a public document they receive, whether in paper or electronic form, they essentially just need to be satisfied of the origin of that document. And what that means, it's sort of defined more in the context of the things that we mentioned before, in terms of that the signature on the document is valid, that the person, I'm talking about the underlying document itself, that is, yeah. So the birth certificate say that the person who signed it is the person they say they are, that person had the appropriate capacity, maybe they're the registrar of births or something for that authority, and that they've put a seal or stamp on it from the Office of Births, Deaths and Marriages in that state or something like that. So those are the three things that they need to be satisfied of, whether in paper or electronic form. We're seeing now, in terms when a public document is actually issued in electronic form, those things can be verified almost like that, and the authority can almost automatically, and in some cases automatically already, issue an apostille on that basis. Previously, that was the kind of thing they'd have to look visually and compare the signatures and kind of look and maybe even contact the issuing authority, and kind of there's a lot of those procedures that have now been streamlined. I think in terms of so that I guess still provides the basis on which to assess those kind of things. I think in terms of raising awareness, I suppose, is the other question. That's a job that I suppose we try and do as well, by bringing the countries together regularly for both meetings, and so that these authorities are familiar with other practices. When a state changes its apostille system, implements electronic apostilles, they often then try and publish it and produce things like guidelines for their citizens, so that they know, and there's a lot of information available on the website of each of the different ministries or authorities that issue them. Though I do think one aspect is that we're still seeing a sort of a legislative lag in some ways. So I think the lobby needs to almost come on the other side too, to say that, we're seeing it in some countries that, legislation that says digital signature is the equivalent of a traditional signature with a pen. And those kind of things are where we need to see the change on the legislative level, so that people don't require paper apostilles, paper documents anymore in order to act upon them. But I do think that for us, we had a system, for example, when New Zealand and Colombia in particular were quite early adopters, but New Zealand had a system for a while that they would issue only e-apostilles, and that would be done. And if ever there was a question about it, they would try and resolve that usually via the embassy or by talking to the authority directly and explaining their procedures and their mechanisms. So it's mainly an awareness there. But then they would sometimes also, so that the user didn't have to wait, they'd issue a paper one just to get that resolved on the short term. But in the longer term, try the lobby by working between government authorities. And I was just quickly, one other thing I was going to mention before is that in terms of the part of the reason there's this public or state authority basis as well, is that obviously because we're dealing with public documents, they're usually issued by public authorities. And I think the exception is almost the case of diplomas, where we see that sometimes that in different countries, and that's why this is such an interesting case. But in terms of a document issuing a birth certificate, a marriage certificate, a civil status document. And so that's why it's harder and sometimes more difficult, because you're constantly dealing with the interaction of public authorities, whereas diplomas is a very interesting example that I think doesn't necessarily have that same public link in a lot of countries.
I think it's a sign of our preparation calls that you anticipated exactly where I was going next, which is in the case of education records, you do have that, that extra dimension that you mentioned, which is the organization that is issuing and the organization that has to attest to the authenticity of that issuer are different organizations. And therein lies, not that software can't solve this, but lies some of the complexity to the learner, to the student, for example, where they have to go to a registrar's office and then have to go over to, in the US context, the state of Indiana, the state of Arizona, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, whatever the context may be. You could imagine a world in which software and online experiences allow those to happen in relatively seamless ways, where you have handoffs, but it still brings an inherent friction to the process that I think underlies that distinction between moving the apostille to a digital issuance versus eliminating the need for the apostille in the first place. It's only in that latter case that we completely streamline the process and empower a university, for example, to both issue the diploma and also in a way that self-certifies the authenticity of the originator themselves without having to involve a sovereign, a state organization like the state of Indiana. Are there best practices that you've seen? You showed, a few examples where you have an issuer of the document and then you have the issuer of the apostille. And those two steps have been made relatively streamlined or efficient in the handoffs between them. Or typically, if you've got two organizations, you are going to have to go through two, for lack of better terms, bureaucratic processes.
I think there is certainly something where there are some countries where, yes, it's the same ministry or something, or if a student says, I need an apostille on my diploma, they put one request in and then their diploma comes directly from the registrar of the university, for example, and gets an apostille on it as well. I must admit, those kind of fully streamlined systems are few and far between at this point in time, partly because it's then required that the onus is on the public ministry and or the university and possibly all the universities in their country to do it. And I think that's where we'd run into a bit of an issue in the US. But I think for diplomas, it would be quite reasonable to have that authentication, dare I say, without the need for an apostille, but you'd still probably need an apostille for all the other different types of public documents. So I think that's what
and maybe in particular in states where you have different competent authorities to issue apostilles for different types of public documents, because there are models where, say, apostilles for diplomas are being issued by the Ministry of Education, whereas, vital records are being issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Internal Affairs or what have you. Now, that is a model that's particularly being pursued interestingly enough, in the former Soviet bloc and Eastern Europe, not so much in the other part of the world. But maybe just to come back also to Tom's question, more generally speaking, I think we, the Secretariat, can do a fairly decent job in encouraging newly acceding states to join as EAPP states. I think we have a case there that we can make. But for long-standing contracting parties, it would help us tremendously if we can join our forces with a group of lobbyists, if I may say, so people interested in seeing the EAPP taking off, so that we collectively talk to the right people. In the US, for example, the addressee of our message should, in the first instance, be the National Association of Secretaries of States. They meet twice a year, and they discuss all sorts of different issues, including how to make the issuance of apostilles more effective and secure. Now, it just so happens that this year we were supposed to attend their summer event and talk about the EAPP and encourage them to implement the EAPP across the US. We'll still see if we can do it through webinars and other means, but I am personally convinced that there is also a case for the GDN, for the Groningen Declaration Network, to maybe join forces with other interested parties to talk to the competent authorities and other government bodies to encourage them to make that step, which is, after all, not that difficult and not that complex, and start issuing electronic apostilles.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that, Christophe. And I'm really sorry, I'm supposed to keep time, and time flies by. But your last remark, of course, you're more than welcome to join us next year. Let's assume that the COVID-19 might not play havoc with world travel at that time, next May 2021 in Ottawa, but that could be your stage. I believe I also heard that Canada is on the verge of becoming a next state to join the Apostille Convention. And after this webinar, we would be pleased to discuss possibilities for furthering the cause, if you like. That's certainly possible. We can't do that now, but I'm really thankful. And with that, I hear a sound indicating to me that we should almost be done. One question from Aditi Kadikia from WES, whether the webinar would be available. Yes, they are available to registered participants. If there would be more interest in this webinar, that's a question for the board of directors to discuss. We may find a way perhaps, but the one reason why we charge fees at this moment is because the COVID-19 has dealt a blow to the finance of the GDN. So we have to find ways to make up a bit for the loss of income. And it's a fine line. And on the one hand, we want to be an international public benefit foundation that basically disseminates best practices for all to share. But at the same time, we too have our costs to cover. I won't burden you with that, but and I see Melanie Gottlieb indicates this will also be available to the GDN signatories in the website. So with that, I think we made it perfectly on time, and I think it would be okay to give a big hands for all of you for having shared us, and I hope to see you again in a not too far away future. Please join me. Okay, and that would be all for today. Yep.